thanks so much, Amy. It's just great and a pleasure to be here today and present this webinar. So the title of this here is Strategies for Success, Key Performance Indicators and Benchmarking. And I've looked over the list of attendees. I just love looking at the people who register for these webinars, and it's great to see it's a really diverse group of people. It's people from all different types of industries and business sizes and different types of roles in your organizations. And I see right now we've got 183 people currently attending this webinar. So a good attendance. I just imagine you all in a big conference room and all staring at me. And so it makes me just a little less nervous, joking, of course. But with that in mind, with the diverse group that we have here, our presentation today is pretty general in nature. But I hope that everybody attending this webinar can take away a few ideas, and then you can apply those and implement those things in your organizations and address your specific needs. So now what I encourage you to do is to put your questions into the Q&A down there at the bottom. There's a Q&A with a couple of bubbles there. Just go in there and type in your questions. We may address those immediately. We may respond to those inside of that chat. Just type those answers in, or we may just save some of those questions to answer live at the end of this webinar. We're going to try to save about 10 minutes or so at the end of this webinar to answer your questions. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. I'm going to talk about myself here first. So my name is Dustin Wheeler, and I'm in the Lehi, Utah office of Eide Bailly. And I'm part of the team that offers outsourced accounting services and advisory to our clients. I work with our partners, our staff, our clients across the country, and I have a focus on using accounting technology to automate and provide more value in the services we provide. I'm also going to share some quick fun facts about the three of us so you can get to know us a little bit. But my claim to fame is that as a young boy, I once ran through a screen door trying to escape from a water balloon fight. Not one of my prouder moments, but it's a good thing that was not filmed. It wasn't in the days of cell phones, because that probably would have gone viral today. I'll introduce here Morgan Hurst. She's part of our data analytics group, and she's out of our Orem, Utah office, and she works alongside data warehousers to automate and analyze financial and operational reports. So she is working on becoming an avid skier since she lives in Utah. Well, of course, here in Utah, we have some of the best skiing in the country. But she's currently hanging out with the 8-year-olds on the bunny hill. No shame in that. I'm there too, Morgan. So, and finally here, Kristen Tafe. She is in our valuation group, and she is based out of the Fargo, North Dakota office of Eide Bailly. Kristen has been with the firm now for 13 years, and she performs valuation services and works with business owners and decision makers on strategic consulting and transaction projects. One thing about Kristen, she listens to an insane number of true crime podcasts, and she's just impatiently waiting for the day that she gets to use that knowledge to solve crime. So a second career on the way here for Kristen. Now we'll move ahead here to the next slide.
Try clicking on it again. There you go.
Okay, there we go. All right, so I want to start us off here by just going over the basics. I want to clearly define this acronym that we'll be referring to several times throughout this webinar. So this acronym, KPI, this is short for Key Performance Indicator, which we'll define as a measurable value that demonstrates how effectively a company is achieving its key business objectives. So to be clear here, a KPI is some kind of number, all right? We can say things like our customers love us and we have a great company. You can say things like that, but those are subjective statements. Well, a KPI is something you can measure. It's a number. It's like saying 90% of our customers gave us 5-star reviews. That would be a KPI. Right? And the purpose of a KPI is to evaluate the performance of an organization as a whole or a particular activity within the organization, such as a project, a product line, a location, or some other initiative. And then we see whether there's success or there's room for improvement. And once you have these numbers, you can use them to hold your teams accountable their progress, or align those teams to measure progress towards some kind of shared strategic goal. That's the purpose of a KPI. And we're going to start off very basic here. I just want to share a few examples of KPIs, very basic ones that we use commonly. These are financial KPIs, ones that you can get out of an accounting system. So the first one that we'll talk about here is the current ratio, and this is calculated as current assets divided by current liabilities. And the word current here typically refers to short term, such as cash, or assets expected to be converted to cash within a year. And current liabilities are those that are expected to be paid to creditors within a year. Okay, and this ratio is one of a few different types of liquidity ratios. That's kind of the group we put those in. The word liquidity referring to the speed and ease at which an asset may be converted to cash, and provides an indication to a company's ability to pay their bills. So this ratio is frequently used by lenders to evaluate the risk of lending money to an organization. So I'm going to share a couple of examples right here of current ratios. So the two examples here, we see one with a current ratio of 1.16. Okay, this one right here. We see a second one of current ratio of 2.22, this one right here. So if you're a lender evaluating these two companies, which one would you rather lend to? Well, you look at company number 2, they have substantially more assets and liabilities. They have almost double the assets of liabilities. So this one is probably a good choice. This one here on the left, they've got just about the same amount of liability as its assets. So not as great of a number there. And there are all sorts of other things that you ought to consider as a lender, but just based on this information alone, well, company number 2 is more financially healthy and more likely to have the ability to pay back the loan than company number 1. So now here at the bottom, we have the total asset turnover, and this is a type of an activity ratio. And these ratios, they help us to evaluate the ability of a company to turn its balance sheet accounts into revenue and show how efficiently a company is using its assets. So this ratio right here is calculated by dividing sales by the total assets of a company. Now, this ratio might be used by investors to help consider whether or not they would invest in the company and how likely they are to get a good return on their investment. So I'm going to show also here a couple of quick examples on a couple of companies here. So you'll see this one down here at the bottom. Company number 1, there's a total asset turnover of 1.71. Now, what that means is that they're turning assets into revenue very quickly. Okay, so that number is good. A low number of assets and a high number of revenue. Now, on the other side here, company number 2. Now, this one has more assets than revenue. So this one is struggling a little bit to generate revenue. Now, again, here as well, there's more information you'd have to consider in an investment decision. You'd want to look at how profitable each company is. You'd want to see what kind of expenses these companies have. But based on this information alone, company number 1 looks like a much better investment than company number 2. Okay. So I'll erase my annotations here and we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, here we go. Financial metrics. Okay, so there's another KPI here that is not a number out of your financial system, not just a financial number, but we're measuring things in terms of a number of days. And one example of this is days sales outstanding. So this one takes the accounts receivable balance divided by the sales for a given period and then multiplies that by 30. So the purpose of this one is to measure how long on average it takes to collect receivables from customers and then understand how many days of revenue you have sitting in accounts receivable. Now, the timeframes that you apply to this calculation are really critical. You want to consider that and perhaps use an average accounts receivable balance and an average sales balance for the last 3 months or maybe even more. And you want to use only credit sales in this calculation because if you use the same day sales, that can kind of skew this number. So just some things to keep in mind here. But we have an example here, an accounts receivable balance of 900,000 and credit sales of 600,000. Well, we do this calculation and we say here in 45 days is typically when you're collecting your accounts receivable from your customers, right? And the next one is kind of the opposite from the days sales outstanding. This one we call the days payable outstanding. Now this one takes the accounts payable balance divided by purchases and multiplies that by 30. So this one gives you an average of how long it takes to pay your vendors. So when you calculate this one, you need to know what types of things you have in accounts payable, such as rent or payroll. Those things can skew this calculation. So just adding a caution here, if you're doing this on your own, just do it carefully. So here's a calculation of an example of this calculation. Our accounts receivable balance is 500,000. Our purchases is 700,000. So on average, we're paying our accounts payable within about 21 days. So now that we have these numbers, we can compare the days sales outstanding to the days payable outstanding, and we can see how fast we are collecting versus how fast we are paying. Now, in these examples, we're not collecting receivables quickly, but we're paying our bills fairly quickly. So if we find ourselves in a cash crunch, well, this could be a big reason why, and we might want to think of ways we can improve the speed of our collections and take a look at the payables as well. So it's generally a good idea to pay his bills on time, but not necessarily early. So if I were the owner of this company, I might try to find ways that we can maybe bring that day sales outstanding to 30 from 45, and maybe try to increase the days payable outstanding, from 21 to 30. And then you're in unison, you're in harmony with that timing, and maybe in a better situation for cash flow. So one more KPI here that I'll share is days cash on hand. And this one takes your cash on hand and divides it by the operating expenses. And this one, by the way, when you do this, you want to exclude the non-cash expenses such as depreciation. Okay, and then you'll take that number divided by 365. So what we're doing here is calculating how many days an organization can survive without revenue and continue to pay its operating expenses. So here's an example. Cash on hand, 150,000. Operating expenses, 900,000. We take that divided by 365, and we get an average. We get an answer here of 61 days. So we can go 61 days without revenue, being able to continue to pay expenses. So here on this slide right here, and as a polling question comes up here, so go ahead and answer that. But I'm going to continue here and say, one mistake that I see small businesses commonly make is that the primary report they use to run and evaluate customers and monitor collections is that accounts receivable aging report that you can pretty easily get out of your software. Now, that report, I think, certainly has its place, but by itself, it doesn't tell the whole story. So in the previous slide, I mentioned days sales outstanding, and I don't think that's a perfect indicator either, but you shouldn't consider that alone by itself. But really, these are just pieces to the puzzle. One pieces to consider along with other metrics. And there are other sales and customer metrics you can monitor also. You could look at the number of new customers, your repeat sales, customer retention, and collection effectiveness. And when you look at the report, such as the one you see here at the bottom of the screen, when we look at a customer level, you can see which ones might require more attention, say with a collection, which ones need more collection efforts. And you might want to look at some of your customers that maybe you can get a repeat sale if you were to put some effort into it. So it takes a combination of several different metrics to see the full picture, and there's software out there that can take all of this information out of your accounting system and generate these reports. So just for your information, these particular screenshots that you see here on the screen, these come up from a software partner of ours called Tally Street. So that may be one to check out. But now, went one slide too far. Here we go. So marketing metrics, these are maybe a little more fun for some people than the accounting metrics. It's always interesting to go in and see how many Facebook likes you get right on a post, but These metrics are just completely non-financial, but I think they're still important to track. So a few examples of this, these are numbers that marketers like to keep tabs on: website visits, Facebook likes, Twitter followers, the return on marketing investment. And these might not have a direct financial impact, but these metrics can provide some insight into other aspects of a company's performance. Measure the reach to your customers and what ways your company is getting the most engagement out of its marketing. And right here, now, this is what I think is the more exciting part of KPIs. This happens when you come up with a mix of a financial number and a non-financial number. And some of the things we're able to do with these is come up with KPIs that are financial standards for success for specific industries. And we're able to compare financial results between companies of different sizes. So for example, sales per square foot, that's a common measurement for retail stores. So if your number here is below average, maybe you're not located in an ideal location. Maybe you don't have an effective store layout. The next one here, revenue per employee. This one is often used in professional services as well as technology and software industries. So this might be an indicator of how productive your employees are. Okay, revenue per available room. Now this one is big in hospitality. So for example, a hotel manager might look at this to see how well a hotel is filling its rooms and how wisely the hotel rooms are priced to try to achieve full capacity. And then we've got revenue per active patient. That's often used in medical practices, comparing one medical practice or dental practice to another. Cost per action. Now that's actually another acronym for CPA, maybe a more exciting one. This one looks at the expenses a company spends to drive conversions for things like white paper downloads and subscriptions. So we're tracking here how effectively marketing dollars are being spent to make those things happen. Now, Kristen, do you have some commentary on some other non-financial KPIs?
Yeah, I completely agree that some of the best metrics to understand success is really mixing that financial with the non-financial data. And the trick is really by industry or whatever your company does is identifying what is a production metric that's quality in your industry. So for example, in accounting, a production metric is charge hours. We use that metric to understand utilization by staff. Mixing charge hours with revenue or financial information helps us to understand realization. Restaurants have similar metrics called a per person average. So this considers like total server sales divided by the number of guests served, and it can identify the per person average sales. Similar metrics can be created for table turn time, guests per hour, those types of things. In hospitality, in addition to the revenue per available room, consideration is given to the average daily rates or the average price paid per room. The total revenue is divided by the total number of rooms occupied. The goal is really just to mix those financial metrics with the non-financial or potentially revenue and production metrics to understand overall performance. And understanding overall performance can be done through benchmarking. So once we have this information, it's important to understand, well, what does it really mean? Am I good at this or am I bad at this? So benchmarking really refers to measuring yourself against others. We look for benchmarking data that's within the same industry. We want those same revenue drivers, same economic and industry drivers, and of a similar size to the company that you are in. In terms of benchmarking, within our valuation group, we reference many different resources to understand industry metrics. For really focusing on financial data, we use industry resources called RMA Statement Studies and Integra by Microbuild. Another one that has maybe the financial and some non-financial metrics is called Profit Sense. All three of these allow you to drill down by industry, within each industry, by revenue size or asset size. So you have that ability to not only look within the specific industry, but also into entities that are comparable in size to yours. Whenever you use any sort of benchmarking application, it's really important to understand where is this information coming from and how many respondents are included in the population. If the information is coming from a place where it's not, very valid or it hasn't been vetted, then that's going to be a problem and it shouldn't necessarily be a population of data you should utilize. So just based on these three, RMA features data from over 770 industries, and it's taken from 200,000 plus statements of financial institutions, borrowers, and prospects. So they work directly with financial institutions. They don't provide, RMA does not have production-based information, only financial metrics, but they do perform a strong vetting of the data. Integra by Microbuild maintains a database of more than 4.5 million private businesses, and the information is developed from public and private sources, including the IRS. And so they have data on about 900 industries, and then they also go into multiple sales size ranges. Once again, no production information, only financial data. What's important here is that when they say for Integra by Microbuild that they utilize data from the IRS, that means that you often will see information that has minimal earnings on that bottom line. So you might see it and be like, wow, none of these are really profitable. Well, it could be because there's some strategic, approach to how they're putting together their tax returns for the IRS. So that's something important to consider when you're looking at data from Integra. The last one that we mentioned here is ProfitSense, and ProfitSense has their own database, and they get people who utilize this database include accounting firms, banks, credit unions. And so when you utilize it, you see information that's provided by other users of the database. So this one does have some KPIs available, but once again, it's going to vary in terms of the number of respondents by industry. So it can be very helpful depending on how niche your industry is. We have used all of these databases. Just RMA is probably my favorite for the financial data specifically, but we do use all of them. Specific industry publications can also provide some guidance, and they publish metrics that mix financial and non-financial data. If those aren't available to you, it's still important to measure those metrics internally and use them as a point of comparison in a monthly or an annual analysis. There are certain industries that do compile data and share with participants. So within dealerships, whether it's vehicles or implements, industry groups often create dealer 20 groups where you share information, you meet multiple times a year with the goal of really improving business performance across the board. And when you share information, it's typically like a blind copy of it. So you might be listed as company A, B, C, D. It isn't saying that this specific entity makes this much money. But the idea really is to understand how you compare to your peers in terms of margins, volume, staffing, sales, any of those things. The same is true in construction, engineering, and in healthcare. There's a ton of options available for those kind of metrics. So there's MGMA, AMGA, Sullivan and Cotter, just a lot of different ones to look to. What's important within the benchmarking space is to consider, like I said before, where's the information coming from? Can they drill down into an industry that's applicable to me? And can they drill down into a size and still have enough respondents that this is meaningful data? So it's important to monitor metrics internally to understand your own trends. You can, even if you aren't able to get that outside data, it still could have a lot of value to you as you look at how performance is going for that entity. And it's also a really good chance to communicate the impact, identify who your stakeholders are and say, these are really applicable KPIs to us. Here's where the industry is, or here's where we were last month. Let's see what we can do with this. It helps you can create buy-in for people to want to invest in your operations. You can provide opportunities for employees to have growth or advancement in their careers. Shareholders are going to love this because it gives them a chance for higher distributions. Really, it's just utilizing benchmarking and KPIs as an opportunity to identify what's important to the stakeholders and then utilize the outcomes to link something else or to identify how we can drive you and say, here's how performance has been, and therefore this is what we get out of it.
So while we're on the topic here, I think we'll take one question here from the chat for Kristen to answer. The question is this data on benchmarking free, or do you have to subscribe or pay?
Typically, they are subscription services or, one-time pull a report. We subscribe to a few different services that provide benchmarking data, but I know that they do single-use reports as well based on industry size, that type of thing.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so now what KPIs should you measure? This is a great question. I'm gonna get you thinking about here, but now you might not be ready for this question yet. And I feel like the place to start is, if you don't know what your business objectives are, you need to get that figured out first. So think about what key business questions you're trying to answer and what kind of outcomes you're trying to achieve. So the KPIs you ultimately decide to measure are driven by your strategy. So second here, think about how you're going to measure what you're trying to achieve. Now, you might need to put a software in place to gather data. You might need to send out a survey. You might need to replace or upgrade existing systems that you have. And then next, you need to avoid information overload and narrow down the KPIs you're going to closely track to a short list. I know some organizations have a rule of 7. They try to keep that the list of KPIs down to this number so they don't have a big cluttered report. Here's a quote here from Robert McNamara. It says, measure what is important, don't make important what you can measure. Very deep. You might have to think about that for a second before you can understand what he's saying. But I'll explain here in that there seems to be a tendency for organizations to track those numbers that are easy to gather and explain, but they might not be the most meaningful or impactful. So it's worth the effort to determine the best KPIs to track, even if it takes some extra work up front to measure and analyze them. Now, tracking KPIs isn't going to do you a lot of good unless you can create a data-driven culture. And I'm going to share a link right here that this is an article in the Harvard Business Review that I read last year, but it explains why it's so hard to create a data-driven company, and that technology is not the biggest barrier. The biggest challenge here is culture and finding ways to incorporate data into the decision-making process. So to overcome this, it requires communication and improving people's skill sets and embracing change. And one way I've noticed companies doing this is incorporating this data into team meetings and regularly revisiting it. And if everyone knows that management is looking at the numbers, then people can tend to keep that in mind. So identifying the technology you're going to use to visualize the KPIs should be the last step in this process, because technology by itself doesn't create value from this data. And Morgan, a little bit later on, she's going to touch on the technology that we use in this webinar. But with that, I'm going to pass this over to, just like the Olympics going right now, I'm going to pass the baton here to Kristen.
Thank you, Dustin. So how do KPIs play into valuation is a really great question to ask yourself. There's a strong overlap between valuation and KPIs. There's really 3 stages in the valuation world where KPIs can come into play. So the first is measuring value. The initial valuation to understand what operations are currently valued at. The second would be building value, using certain metrics and data to identify a way to build value. And then the third one would be realizing value, or upon exit or a set period of time in the future, compared to that original business value. So just to start us off, an overview of valuation approaches. There's 3 different approaches in the valuation world. The income approach, which focuses on the cash flows, a rate of return, and the 2 of those combined give us a value. The market approach, which focuses on actual transactions in the marketplace. So identifying a population of comparable transactions and utilizing those multiples to help derive a value for your business. And then the last approach is the asset approach, which looks at the underlying assets of the organization. So where do KPIs come into play in the valuation world? Well, we consider KPIs when we're valuing a company in a couple different places. The first one is just understanding business organization or business operations. So a key part of performing evaluation is financial analysis. We need to identify the trends and performance year over year and as compared to the industry. So that's a big part of, understanding what's happened over this course of time and how do you compare to the industry numbers that we look at from the benchmarking resources we've previously discussed. We want to understand if you're a high performer or a low performer as compared to industry or as compared to your past performance. And we want to understand the impact of certain economic and industry changes on your operations. The next place where we consider KPIs is really in the development of the income approach. So not only do we have to look at the earnings stream to say what's indicative of the future, but we have to understand what type of risk is associated with your operations. And that can really be done, something that really aids in that is understanding those KPIs. So a higher risk rate has a lower value. We take information from discussion with owners and stakeholders and that financial analysis and other research to determine an appropriate rate of risk to apply to your operations. So that's where we consider both financial and non-financial aspects and metrics. And then in the market approach, we also consider KPIs there. After we have that comparable population of transactions and we have the multiples from those transactions, we need to identify what's appropriate for your company. And typically KPIs can help us to understand what is most comparable. How would you be priced compared to this other transaction that did happen? And so looking at those really provides us with a guideline of where to start with those multiples. So that would be the first step in understanding how, the original value of the company. You can also use KPIs to build value. So after evaluation is performed, KPIs can help identify a strategic plan to build additional value. So we can use those to monitor progress and success along the way. So to build value at a high level, you want to reduce risk and improve cash flows. And we want those cash flows to be, the better the cash flows, the more attractive to a potential owner. So to improve cash flows, focus on growing new revenues, improving margins, effectively managing your assets. Some KPIs that could be considered there: growing revenue. What's my sales mix? What are my year-over-year trends? Improving margins. Let's look at your gross profit margin, your EBITDA margin. Let's look at other profitability ratios like your return on equity and assets. What about managing assets? What are my leverage ratios or activity ratios, working capital turnover or total asset turnover? It's important to know that in order to actually build value, you have to focus on the organization as a whole. You can't just hold down expenses for a few years. That isn't a long-term growth solution. I have a couple of examples of how KPIs can come into play here. So this first one is focusing on building value. So we have the same company, and then we have the original valuation, and then the results from a few years later after a few KPIs were put into place and those were measured and tracked. So the clients had an exit timeline and wanted to start preparing to exit. And we utilized KPIs to set those goals to build value. The original goals were to grow revenue, reduce key customer reliance. So that's a qualitative item that impacts how risky operations are. Improve your gross profit margins, maintain overhead expenses, improve inventory metrics, and reduce risk by reducing reliance on one person. So you can see in the first gray column, that's the original value, was at about $5 million. The goal was to double the value of this entity plus, so get it to about $12 million. What we saw were some hits. This company had success in growing revenue, and they had success in better managing their inventory. There were also some misses along the way. The gross margin, we didn't quite get where we wanted to go. I mean, it improved a little bit, but not quite as much as they wanted. And then there was a few qualitative items too that weren't there. So we didn't quite get to the value that we wanted to achieve, but you can certainly see that growth was achieved overall. And those KPIs just to help keep everybody on track along that way. The second example is using KPIs to make strategic decisions. So this focuses on the idea that not every bad metric is a bad business decision, and not every really great metric means that the business is doing great. So here we have two companies, A and B, and we're showing 3 years of operations. The entity on the right invested about $1.5 million in new equipment in year 2. That created important efficiencies in operations and allowed them to target new customers without changing their workforce. It was risky though, so you can see that our debt ratios increase. Our debt ratios were less attractive as compared to company A. But along with that, profitability was able to increase. They were able to pay down that debt because they were able to get those customers in the door, service them, and just push more money to the bottom line. The company on the left didn't make those investments, and therefore their ratio stayed about the same. Really, they were only able to grow so much on the top line revenue, and their EBITDA margin wasn't able to change that much. So what to take out of this is that if your goal is to always beat the industry, it could restrict your growth. Consider strategy and using your KPIs as a way to get there. And making a large investment could result in some a decline in those ratios for a short period of time. So you need to map out what that looks like, what the recovery looks like. You just can't, once again, can't just build value from cutting costs. There might have to be some of those other things that come into play. And in the meantime, it might impact some of your overall KPIs. So understanding why they might be down or up is important. The last example I have here is really focusing on different KPIs to measure your success. So we have 3 hotels with different strategic goals. So Hotel B values occupancy. You can see the yellow highlight, they want 90% occupancy. That results in an average charge rate of $140. Hotel C values rates. They want to charge more, have less, variable costs because they don't need their workforce on hand quite as much. But so they're 70% occupancy, but they have a higher rate per night at $190. And company A values multiple KPIs. They focus on both the occupancy and that average charge rate. What this shows is that, company C may think, hey, we charge the most. We definitely have the highest valuation, or we definitely have the most cash flows. Company B may be saying, but we have people here every single night. Our occupancy is nearly 100%. That's amazing. We're so great. Company A is the one that's really going to come out ahead in this situation. Not only are they the most profitable, which you can see in the bottom yellow highlighted, but they also have the highest average room rate of $140 per night. So that's combining the average charge rate and the occupancy together to understand that this entity is actually making the most money because they combined multiple KPIs to generate success. All right, I'm going to hand the webinar over to Morgan now. She will be talking about KPIs and data analytics.
Thanks, Kristen. There we go. Going along the same lines of the importance of KPIs, I like to view them as a sort of business wellness check. So a physical wellness check is going to look a lot different for an elderly man than a female Olympic athlete. Similarly, KPIs and your business valuations through KPIs should look different industry to industry and company to company. And Dustin, I love that he kind of threw out the 7 number. It's always important to be looking at more than just one key performance indicator. If you went to a doctor's office and they checked your blood pressure and said, "Okay, you're really healthy, like go home, you're good," I'd be really skeptical, right? Because blood pressure isn't a good indicator of overall business health. Similarly, there isn't a single KPI that can tell you if your company is doing well. That's why you need to be strategic in choosing an array of KPIs that represent your business well and give you a better idea of your overall business health. Benchmarking, I know that Kristen's already touched on this quite a bit, but benchmarking is another tool that's used to decide maybe where to direct your focus and what KPIs need more or less attention. So similarly, it's always important to use at least 2 benchmarks when looking at your actuals and comparing it to other things. So industry standard was talked a lot about. There's also goals. So you can create goals based off of your business objectives and where you want to be. And then my personal favorite is historical actuals. And again, it's always important to use 2 benchmarks to give you a full picture. So for example, you could be comparing your profit margin this year to industry standard and feel like you fall way short. But then if you compare your profit margin to what you did last year, you might see that you've grown a lot and improved a lot and that you're on pace to getting to industry standard in the next 6 months. And so again, you want that full picture always illustrated when you are evaluating your KPIs. And benchmarking does really help direct your focus. Let's say you're looking at 5 key performance indicators, and when you compare them to your important benchmarks, 3 of them you're overperforming on. They probably need less attention and focus than the 2 that need improvement and are maybe failing a little bit. And maybe one that's cash flow related is even more urgent than other ones that are underperforming. Once you kind of know where to direct your focus, it's important to use KPIs to kind of drill down into the data and diagnose the problem. So in this example, it's a retail store who is focusing on profit margins. Profit margins aren't where they need to be, and they consider that an urgent KPI that they want to improve. And so after you kind of decide on that KPI and see that based off benchmarks, it needs improvement, it's kind of time to dig into the data and see why it isn't where you want it to be. So a good place to start is to look at gross profit by location. As a retail store, let's say you have 5 locations, and maybe by looking at each location, you realize that 4 of them are actually doing well, and 1 of them is well below standard and is dragging down that overall number. You can also look at gross profit by product. Maybe you have unprofitable products that you didn't know about, or some of your high volume products actually have low margins. Gross profit by manufacturer. You could look at retail versus online sales, promotions that are being held. There's a ton of different ways to look into data to figure out what is going on and why your numbers aren't where you expect them to be or maybe want them to be. And this diagnosis of a problem should always lead you to act and lead you to change and move forward and improve that metric. So going along the same example of gross profit in a retail chain, you might go into your successful locations and try to mirror pricing and strategies in your failing one to try to improve profit margin. You might go into your product pricing and change prices to improve certain margins, or even maybe change marketing strategies so you're focusing on more higher margin products. You might consider doing more business with a higher margin manufacturer, or maybe take an opportunity to negotiate prices to improve margins on one that might be lower and not quite as high as other ones that you're working with. So again, the diagnosis of a problem should always prompt action. And I feel like KPIs really give you the power to change your business and improve your business and make it what you want to be. And data analytics, which is what my department specializes in, exists because of KPIs. Data analytics is the transformation, organization, and modeling of data to help businesses make better and more timely decisions. And so I just kind of wanted to break this concept of data analytics up into a few different parts. So the first is data analytics gives you a complete view of your data in kind of two different ways. The first one is that it has all your data living in a single place. So time tracking data, financial data, sales data, marketing data, all your locations are living in one place. And that's important for a lot of different reasons. And obviously you're going to keep tracking your time in a different software than you're going to be inputting financials, but it's so nice to be able to have everything in one location to make for easy diagnosis and analysis of your KPIs and more streamlined reports. It's also complete in the sense that it's accurate. So there's one source of truth. You're pulling a KPI the exact same way today as you did a few months ago. And it also safeguards your data. So there's data warehouses that specialize, data warehousers that specialize in making sure your data is complete and accurate. Data warehouses are built to catch data entry errors so that you're not having to deal with any duplicate data or incomplete emails or weird transactions. And so in addition to data analytics helping your data be complete, it also is really timely. Timeliness, I feel like, is so important when making business decisions and when reviewing KPIs. It's timely in two senses. It's available. So all your reports are in one place. When Sally gives her 2 weeks notice, you don't have to worry about her walking out the door with 10 of the reports that you're used to seeing. Or you don't have to look back in your emails and try to find a report that was sent to you 3 weeks ago, or worry about sucking up resources, requesting reports for KPIs that might not be easy to track down or easy to measure. It's also timely in the sense that everything is automated. So from daily to real time, you can pull up your reports that are in one centralized location, usually on like an online software like Power BI or Tableau. And you can know that you're looking at today's numbers or this hour's numbers or even this minute's numbers. And so you're never looking at outdated data and making poor decisions because the data is not timely. And then again, you're no longer manually recreating reports. So a few months ago, a client came to us and a KPI that was really important to them was project profitability. They had found that their projects weren't as profitable as they thought they had been, but creating a report to give them that visibility took a lot of time. And so they wanted to start tracking it regularly so that they could improve it, but didn't know where to start because they didn't have the resources to have their financial team putting 40, 50 hours a month in to track project profitability. So once the data was all in one place, we were able to create an automated report that probably took 20, 30 hours. But the difference is that report now refreshes every day, and that takes very minimal maintenance to keep up to date. And so now you're not only able, and that company was not only able to look at project profitability once a month, but they can look at it every day and month to date. and compare different timelines. And so that is the timeliness of data analytics and how that can really streamline your KPIs and the diagnosis and action plan to help improve them and get your company to where you want it to be. The third thing is, oh, there is another polling question for anyone that didn't see that pop up. The third thing data analytics is it's powerful. So I have an accounting background, and I remember leaving my first accounting class, and it was the first time I'd really dealt with Excel and thinking Excel is this most powerful tool. There's so much you can do in it, and just being amazed at all the amazing things in Excel. And I still love Excel. It's still like my comfort zone, but because of data analytics and advanced technology, there's so much power and so much more power now in data and using your data to drive your business. So again, all your data is in one place. So let's say you're looking at a report in Tableau or Power BI. It's two softwares we like to use. And let's say you're looking at profit margin again. So profit margin is a very broad number. But in a click of a button, you can drill down and you can see profit margin by location. And then you can see profit margin by product type, and then by product, and then by transaction. And then you can see the memo on the transaction. So data analytics is powerful in the sense that you can see as much or as little data as you need to. And that makes diagnosis of problems so much easier. So many times in my career, I've seen profit margin or another metric and known that it looks low or it looks off and something has to be wrong. So then I log on to 3 softwares to check data there. And then I export 75 transactions to review those. And 6 hours later, I finally figure out that something was entered incorrectly into the system. Well, now it takes 5 clicks and 5 minutes to solve that same problem. And that is the power of how data analytics really drives key performance indicators. It's also beautiful. So Excel reports are sometimes hard to digest, and these more streamlined modern report mechanisms is really easy to look at. They're accessible to be shared with anybody in the company. You can also control who sees what. So as a CEO, you could see all of the reports that the company generates, but as a salesman, you can limit their access to just their sales quota and pipeline. And so it's just beautiful and accessible, and it is more user-friendly so that reports and KPIs are being used more and you're able to hold people more accountable to them. I am going to kind of just skip over this slide. Slides should be sent out after this presentation, but this is just a good reflection of where you and your company might be in your data awareness. So level 1's more unaware. You're operating strictly off of one-off reports. You're not really using data to make decisions. And then level 5 is transformative. So a lot of report automation, really leveraging your data to improve your company. The last really important part of data analytics is, as I describe it, it is a pretty technical process. So it usually requires some sort of on-site or outsourced business intelligence. And because of this, I feel like the cost savings part is really important. Up to 65% of your costs with data analytics are refundable via an R&D tax credit. And so it makes it a more viable options for mid-sized to larger businesses to outsource this element of their business to streamline their KPIs. Again, data analytics is there to drive your KPIs and set your business up for positive change. And just to echo what Dustin and Kristen said, the best place to start is to know your company's objectives and then to figure out which KPIs are the best reflection of your business and best numbers to track.
We don't have any questions right now in the Q&A. So if you have questions you'd like to ask us, now is the time. We've got about 8 minutes until the top of the hour. So please go down and type in what questions you have. While we're waiting for that, maybe we can discuss maybe one question that's commonly come up here. And so a question here for Kristen. What KPIs are most used for a company evaluation?
You know, we use a lot of them depending on the business. Obviously, one of the first things that we look at is going to be profitability when you take out any discretionary items from earnings. So we're going to focus on profitability first, but then we're also going to look at the top line growth. We're going to look at any sort of changes year over year that we see. There isn't one specific KPI that I would say is the most important and the only one to focus on. I think it really truly is a mix of all those things. We want to look at the activity ratios and how they compare to industry. We want to look at how they're using their assets and have they made any investments lately where is that something that we need to take into consideration? Is everything 60 years old and really needs to be replaced right now? So there's a lot of different ones to focus on there.
Okay, great. Question for you, Morgan. Can you talk more about how data analytics qualify for R&D tax credits?
Yeah, so there's like, I guess, a few tricks to it, but as long as you make sure that the firm that you're using is going off of a fixed fee model, it's tax deductible because it is considered research and development for your company. And so when you go to file taxes, as long as it's under that fixed fee, you will be able to deduct those expenses.
Yeah, and R&D tax credits is a service that iBailey provides. So, feel free to reach out to us to learn more about the R&D tax credit. It's definitely a very big credit for a lot of the companies that we work with. I also noticed there's some questions here in the chat, which I didn't notice until now, but we do have some questions here. How do you value intangible assets when valuing a company in an M&A scenario?
So whenever you're going to value a company and you're utilizing either an income or a market approach, the value of intangible assets is part of what value conclusion you come up with there. So if we say that this is our earnings stream and this is our rate of return, when you put those together and you identify a value, let's say just for the purposes of this, it's $5 million, but your balance sheet shows maybe $2 million in equity, that difference is going to be attributed to the intangible value of the company. That's going to be your customer relationships. It's going to be your workforce in place. It's going to be all of those other things that make your company what it is. So when you're thinking about valuing for any sort of scenario under either an income approach model or a market approach model, that intangible value is built into the conclusion that you have.
Okay, another question for Kristen. What KPI do you find most helpful to the community as stakeholders in a government entity where profitability isn't the main priority?
I don't work too much in the government space utilizing KPIs, but I can reach out to a couple people in our office that do and get back to that individual. That's not one that I know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
But yeah, there are importance with KPIs, even if profit is not the motive, because we work with nonprofits who may go out and say advertise, to potential donors, telling them a certain number of people were served or helped with the organization's cause, right? So yeah, that's a great question there. So one for Morgan, what does outsourcing data analytics include? Is this a service or a build and implement?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different routes you can go. At iBailey, we really pride ourselves on offering a very custom solution based off of each company's needs. But I would say kind of the natural evolution of it is to kind of go in and centralize your data either on, sometimes we'll host the data for you, or some companies prefer to have it hosted on their own tenant. And so the first step is to centralize your data, which is done through a data warehouser. And then from there, a lot of people kind of like a done for you data warehouse. So from there, we create reports that you want. We watch the data warehouse to make sure all the data is pulling in accurately and timely. And so that you can just confidently look at all your reports and know you're backed by professionals and that everything is running smoothly. But larger companies, of course, require oftentimes a bigger solution. So they usually have a mix of on-site developers that they'll leverage, as well as oftentimes outsourced help as well.
All right, thank you. Another question here, do nonprofits qualify for an R&D tax credit? Unfortunately, that's not the expertise of the three of us here on this call. That's a great question to ask the person that you work with at iBailey and see if you can get that question answered by the R&D team. I'll follow up with you on that question, Laura. So thanks for asking that. I don't see any other questions, so I think we can wrap up.
All right, guys. I was just making sure there's no other questions. We are good. So just thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Morgan, Kristen, and Dustin for presenting. And we hope everyone had a great day, and we will talk to you guys next time. Thanks, guys.